Unabridged, a division of Recorded Books, presents Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush, and the Invasion of Iraq, by Melvyn P. Leffler. Read by Christopher P. Brown. Preface. On September 11, 2001, I walked by the White House at about 8:20 a.m. on a beautiful, cloudless, sunny Tuesday morning. I recall the light traffic on the street, the relative tranquility as I meandered alongside the Treasury Building and turned right on 15th Street to head to the Woodrow Wilson International Center, located in the Ronald Reagan Building on Pennsylvania Avenue. It was the onset of a new academic year, and I hoped to use my time as a visiting scholar to make progress on my book dealing with the Cold War. Shortly after I arrived, I noticed a small group of people standing in a lounge watching television. I had been at the Wilson Center many times, and I had never noticed anyone doing this. I joined them to see what was going on, and watched repeated pictures of a jet flying into one of the towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. The horrifying, spectacular scene was mesmerizing. Hushed, a group of us stood there together. After listening to commentators speculate about what had happened, I think I walked away, and then returned. I don't really remember. But then I watched another jet crash into the second tower, and saw the ensuing chaos as flames engulfed the upper floors and the towers collapsed. The Wilson Center closed. Rumors circulated that the Reagan Building might be a target of another attack. I do not recall being scared, just shocked. I left around noon to walk to my apartment about a mile away. The streets were eerily quiet, deserted. I called my daughter, who lived a few blocks away. She came over, and we spent the evening watching the same scenes again and again on television. We did not talk much. We were too absorbed in our own thoughts. What did it mean? Why did it happen? What next? The rest of the year remains a blur. I tried to stay focused on my research, but it was not easy. Every day there were rumors of new terrorist attacks. Routines at the Wilson Center were disrupted when letters with anthrax spores circulated in the mail and killed some postal workers. Government buildings, including the Wilson Center, instituted new regimes of security. Book deliveries from the Library of Congress were disrupted, and Internet access was restricted. These personal inconveniences were inconsequential as larger developments unfolded. President George W. Bush launched the global war on terror, overthrew the Taliban government in Afghanistan, declared new threats from an axis of evil, and identified Saddam Hussein's Iraq as a gathering menace that had to be confronted. I went to England for the 2002-2003 academic year to be the Harmsworth Professor of History at the University of Oxford. The big event of the year for a Harmsworth professor is the so-called inaugural address, then occurring, paradoxically, at the end of the year. I had every intention of crafting my Harmsworth lecture around the research I was doing on the Cold War. But during the fall of 2002, I was beleaguered by British students and scholars, pressing me to explain why the Bush administration was discarding the doctrines of deterrence and containment and embracing preemptive wars. I did not enjoy the position I was in, trying to elucidate, and often forced to defend, the logic of policies I did not fully grasp nor necessarily support. My best friend, the late philosopher John Arthur, who was also spending the year at Oxford, asked me one day why I was planning to give my Harmsworth lecture on the Cold War. Nobody, he mused, cared about the Cold War anymore. Talk about recent events. Put 9/11 in historical perspective, he insisted. John enlisted my wife to join him in the campaign to shift the focus of my lecture. I did, reluctantly. In May 2002, I presented my Harmsworth lecture on 9/11 and American Foreign Policy. Unintentionally, That talk reshaped the trajectory of my interests over the next 20 years. Although I returned to the United States and finished my book on the Cold War, I also began to write short articles on the Bush administration's foreign policy. I contested the idea that his policies constituted a radical turn or spectacular aberration. Unilateralism, preemption, military preponderance were not new phenomena, I argued, nor was the quest for a liberal, open international marketplace. I was not seeking to excuse, praise, or criticize the president and his advisers. I was just trying to place their actions and predilections in historical perspective. I met Eric Edelman in 2009. Eric was a professional Foreign Service officer, but had had a unique career, among other things, working for Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot during the administration of Bill Clinton, and then serving on the staff of Vice President Dick Cheney in 2001 and 2002. After being appointed ambassador to Turkey, he returned to Washington and served as the Undersecretary of Defense during the second Bush term, 2005 to 2008. As an undergraduate student at Cornell University, my alma mater, Eric had taken courses with the renowned historian of American foreign policy Walter Lefebvre. He had been in the discussion section of my closest academic friend, Frank Castigliola, and they had retained some ongoing contact as Eric went on to graduate school in history at Yale and then shifted to a foreign service career. Through Frank and through my connections at UVA's Miller Center for Public Policy, I was introduced to Eric. One day we had lunch together at the Boar's Head Inn. Eric surprised me. Although he had spent the last 30 years working in the government, he was incredibly well-versed in the academic literature on American foreign policy. He was intimately familiar with my own writings. I told him I had written a bit about the Bush administration and was pondering the idea of a big book about the profound impact of 9/11 on American foreign policy, resembling a volume I had written about the transformation of American foreign policy during the Truman years. He strongly encouraged me to do so. I told him the big constraint was the paucity of primary source documents because so few of them were declassified. Acknowledging that was a huge impediment, Eric said that if I embarked on the project, he would help me secure interviews with many of the leading policymakers in the Bush administration, his former colleagues. I was intrigued. I felt challenged. I had not relied on interviews for my previous books, and I wondered how much I would gain from talking to former policymakers, whose ability to spin, I wagered, might exceed my ability to probe. However tempting, I also wondered if interviews could adequately substitute for real documents, the hundreds and hundreds of archival boxes that I routinely examined for my previous books. Whether they could or could not, I doubted that Eric would make good on his promise to arrange interviews, or whether I would have the gumption to go ahead with them. Eric did carry out his commitment. He quickly introduced me to Paul Wolfowitz, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's Chief of Staff, and Steve Hadley, President Bush's former National Security Advisor. Other friends introduced me to Richard Clark, the counterterrorism expert on the staff of the National Security Council. Lee Hamilton, the former congressman and director of the Wilson Center, helped facilitate an interview with General Colin Powell, who had served Bush as Secretary of State. Bob Jervis, an acclaimed scholar of international relations and expert on the CIA, put me in contact with Michael Morrell, the president's CIA briefer, with whom I had 2 long, productive interviews. And on it went. I began talking to these policymakers, officials, and analysts in 2010, and have been doing so, off and on, for more than 10 years. Some of them, like Wolfowitz and Libby, I interviewed multiple times at the very outset of this project. Others, like William Burns, the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Condoleezza Rice, Bush's National Security Advisor, I spoke to much more recently on the phone or by a Zoom video link. Still others, like Steve Biegun and Elliot Abrams, I talked to over long lunches. The interviews were fascinating. I quickly realized that I could not write a comprehensive overview of the administration's foreign policies, but would need to narrow my focus. To interviewees, I made it clear that I was a historian trying to figure out what seemed among the most momentous decisions of the 21st century: the articulation of a global war on terror and the invasion of Iraq. I emphasized that I hoped to write a book, but I was in no hurry. I told my interviewees that I had no fixed views and that I wanted to understand what happened. I stressed that I still hoped to secure lots of important documents through declassification requests that other scholars and institutions, as well as I, were submitting. I made it clear that I had read extensively in the excellent journalistic literature that already had appeared. Much of that literature was critical, and my questions sometimes irked my interlocutors. "Forget everything I had read," Scooter Libby said to me one day. I had no intention of doing that. My questions invited officials to tell me what they thought they were trying to do and why. I encouraged them to describe the environment in which they were working, the emotions they felt, and the pressures they encountered. I asked them about the policy process, about who was making policy, and how decisions were shaped. I questioned them about President Bush, his role, and his strengths and weaknesses. I focused a lot on the intelligence information they were gathering and examining, and how it shaped policy outcomes. I queried why things went so wrong so quickly once the Iraqi regime was toppled. Most of Bush's advisers were eager to talk and inform. They seemed exceptionally willing to explain important and complex decisions to an academic who they regarded as open-minded. Occasionally they expressed frustration, even bitterness, with colleagues in other departments. Sometimes they stridently defended what they did. At other times they lamented policy outcomes that they still could not quite grasp. Frequently they told me that it was good I was speaking to them, that the written record would never illuminate precisely what they had experienced. I did not believe that last comment. I had spent most of my academic career examining documents in archival boxes. I was, and remain, a firm believer in the power of written evidence. Policymakers themselves often do not realize how much gets written in complex bureaucratic environments where officials must inform one another about what has occurred. I made a commitment to myself to examine as much of the written record that I could access. My interviews, and those being conducted by the entirely separate Miller Center Oral History Project on the Bush administration, would supplement and complement the written record, not replace it. I filed requests for documents. Although some of them still have not been acted upon, most of them have been denied, in part or in full. But I was helped by other scholars and organizations, especially the National Security Archive. They, too, were seeking to illuminate the documentary history of the Bush administration. They filed Freedom of Information and mandatory declassification requests. Documents started to appear in the Internet reading rooms of government agencies and on the website of the National Security Archive. Several policymakers like Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, Douglas Feith, the Undersecretary of Defense, and Bill Burns used their influence to secure the declassification of key documents that enriched their own accounts of the history of the administration. Most important, the British Parliament authorized a special inquiry to investigate the decision of Prime Minister Tony Blair to align Britain with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Under the leadership of Sir John Chilcot, his investigative committee, including eminent historians like Lawrence Freedman and Martin Gilbert, interviewed every leading British policymaker, secured the release of hundreds of documents and reports, and published a voluminous, comprehensive analysis of British policymaking. These interviews and memoranda often revealed a tremendous amount about the Bush administration's thinking and calculations. Among other things, I came to understand how much the two leaders, Bush and Blair, detested Saddam Hussein, and how much their view of his defiance, treachery, and barbarity affected their calculations. I realized that the story of intervention could not be told without illuminating the Iraqi tyrant's role and agency. His record and his behavior made a difference and had to be integrated into any overall analysis of U.S. decision-making. Many Iraqi records, including tapes of some of the Iraqi dictator's conversations, were seized by U.S. forces, and dozens of Hussein's colleagues and advisors were captured and interrogated by U.S. officials and intelligence analysts. Saddam Hussein himself spent years in prison, during which he was interviewed extensively. He talked at length about his challenges, ambitions, setbacks, and aspirations. Although incomplete, scholars can gain valuable insights into what the Iraqi dictator was thinking and doing, and how his actions affected the calculations and decisions of U.S. officials. This book seeks to explain the most consequential U.S. foreign policy decision of the 21st century. Although reeling from the attack on 9/11, at the time the Bush administration decided to invade Iraq, the United States remained the world's hegemon with unparalleled military power and unchallenged economic superiority. The terrorist attack, moreover, aroused sympathy from around the world and modulated simmering resentment of its so-called hyperpower. But a decade or so later, much had changed. With the United States still mired in Iraq, now fighting the Islamic Caliphate, or ISIS, its standing in the world had been tarnished, its power challenged, its economic dominance receding, and its internal cohesion fraying. The war in Iraq demoralized the American people, intensified their partisan divisions, and shattered trust in their government. Abroad, it alienated key allies, aroused widespread anti-Americanism, and devastated its moral authority. It destroyed many lives and consumed enormous resources, energy, and time. It distracted attention from the challenges in Afghanistan, the rising power of China, the swelling anger inside Russia's Kremlin, and the growing warnings about climate change. Rather than abetting the overall war on terrorism, it complicated that struggle, fueling Muslim grievance and attracting adherents to join a wholly bloody struggle. In the long history of the United States, then, the Iraq War may well be seen as a critical turning point, the onset of a trajectory into a far grimmer future than that anticipated at the end of the Cold War, just a decade or so before. The aims of this book are straightforward. I want to examine why the United States decided to invade Iraq and why the war went awry so quickly, leading to tragedy for Iraqis and Americans. I try to correct some widely held misconceptions, yet also confirm some of the established wisdom. I place President Bush at the center of the policymaking process, where he unquestionably belongs. I stress his fears, his sense of responsibility, and his concerns for homeland security. I discuss his war plans and his strategy of coercive diplomacy. I emphasize the distinction between his motives and his goals, and explain how a war for security morphed into an exercise in nation-building and democracy promotion without adequate preparation. I highlight the dysfunction within the administration and explain why things went awry so quickly. The invasion of Iraq turned into a tragedy, but not, as some accounts have it, because of an inattentive chief executive easily manipulated by neoconservative advisors. Over many years, my commitment to this project has been sustained by my growing conviction that too much of the history of the Bush administration has been entwined with partisan, personal, and ideological battles that have made it difficult both to empathize and criticize. I try to do both. Too many accounts that stress the lying, The manipulation and the preconceived predilections of officials obfuscate the real lessons of the tragic intervention in Iraq. As I explain in my conclusion, it is consoling to think that if we had had smarter, more honest policymakers, all would have turned out well and good. The truth of the matter is that it is hard to garner accurate information and to assess it objectively. It is hard to measure threats. It is hard to deal with unpredictable, brutal, defiant tyrants. It is hard to balance means and ends. It is hard to temper predilections and prejudices. It is hard to gauge the reactions of people one knows little about. It is hard to master our fears, discipline our power, and curb our hubris. However tempting it is to level criticism at President Bush and his advisors, and we most definitely should, we need to recognize collectively that the exercise of prudence and the judicious use of power have not, historically, been among our finest qualities as Americans. We must improve. 1. Saddam Hussein. Wretched were the conditions into which Saddam Hussein was born in April 1937 in the tiny hamlet of Fallujah, just a few miles south of Tikrit. He never knew his father, a poor, landless peasant who died or disappeared before Saddam left his mother's womb. His mother, impoverished, could not care for him, and gave infant Saddam to her brother, Khairallah Talfa. Shortly thereafter, Khairallah, an army officer, was imprisoned for his nationalist, anti-British actions, and Saddam was handed back to his mother, who by now had remarried her former husband's brother, Hassan al-Ibrahim. Hassan despised the child, and often beat him with a stick. Having no job of his own, Hassan did not send his stepson to school, and encouraged the young boy to steal neighbors' chickens and eggs. In Fallujah, Saddam Hussein grew up in a mud hut. There was no running water, no electricity, no toilet, no kitchen. He slept on the floor in a single room. Animals roamed in and out of the hut. Family members, including his 3 younger half-brothers, ate with their hands from a communal pot. Neighborhood kids played in dirty alleys, formed gangs, fought, and feuded. Children mocked Saddam because he had no father. With no real friends, he learned that to survive he had to be tough, cunning, and self-sufficient. His given name, Saddam, meant one who confronts, and he did so as a young boy, fighting, stealing, lying, and inflicting cruelty on little animals. In 1947, his uncle, Khairallah, was released from prison. Saddam's mother sent her 10-year-old son back to Tikrit to live with him, his wife, and their 2 children, Adnan and Sajita. Sacked from the army, Khairallah now became Saddam's teacher and mentor. In the early 1950s, Khairallah moved his family to Baghdad and took Saddam with him. They settled in Al-Kark, a section of the city inhabited by poor Sunni and Shia. Khairallah taught school, socialized with former and active duty army officers, and indulged in the never-ending political conspiracies. He hated Jews and Persians alike, but his energy was focused on toppling the existing monarchy, upending the Sunni elite, and excising all semblance of British colonial rule. Khairallah kindled his nephew's nationalist fervor, political passions, and social grievance. He registered Saddam in school, demanded hard work and discipline, and whetted his ambitions. He introduced him to his military buddies, among them his cousin, Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, who would subsequently become a leader of the Ba'ath Party and the key to Hussein's ascent in revolutionary Iraq. Khairallah indulged Hussein's penchant for political street fighting, gangs, and violence. Hussein acquired a gun, intimidated his enemies, and beat up opponents. As an adolescent, Saddam Hussein made a reputation on the streets of Baghdad. In July 1958, a group of military officers led by Abd al-Karim Qasim overthrew the king in a bloody seizure of power. The new rulers were divided among themselves, some ardent Iraqi nationalists, some with Ba'ath sympathies, and some with communist predilections. Hussein hung out with young members of the small Ba'ath Party, although not yet a member himself. The Ba'ath stood for unity, freedom, and socialism. When Qasim chose a nationalist path over Arab unity, the Ba'ath turned against the new government. Hussein joined them, inciting students to protest and riot. Amid the turmoil, he and Khairallah went back to Tikrit to wreak vengeance on a communist who had insulted his uncle. Hussein murdered the man and went to prison for 6 months. Upon his release, he was recruited for an assassination attempt on Qasim himself. The plot failed, and Hussein escaped, first to Tikrit and then crossed the border into Syria. In Damascus, he met the Syrian founder of the Ba'ath Party, Michel Aflaq. Hussein impressed Aflaq, and then moved on to Egypt, where he finished high school, enrolled briefly in law school, and spent considerable time reading and talking politics. He was a lonely young man, unhappy, with few friends, and no social life. While in Cairo, he agreed that he would marry Khairallah's daughter, his cousin, with whom he had lived many years as a child and teenager. Marrying one's cousin, solidifying family alliances, was what Tikritis did. In 1963, the Ba'ath seized power, killed Qasim, and launched a bloody crackdown on their key opponents, the communists. Hussein returned to Baghdad, after stopping in Syria and conferring again with Aflaq. Hussein may also have garnered support from CIA agents who were assisting the Ba'ath in Baghdad and encouraging them to hunt down and kill Iraqi communist leaders. Hussein joined the mayhem, recruited allies on the streets of Baghdad, and collaborated closely with Nadim Khazar, a young Shia Ba'athite already notorious for his cruelty and torture. Far more important, Uncle Khairallah convinced his cousin, General Bakr, to take Saddam as a young assistant. With revolver in hand, Saddam served as Bakr's personal bodyguard and focused on murdering communist foes on the streets of Baghdad. Bakr soon emerged as a leader of the coup and took the post of prime minister. But the victors again splintered, and right-wing military officers pushed Bakr aside. With no real base of popular support, the Ba'ath were toppled and again went into opposition. Hussein, smartly, positioned himself as an aide to Bakr. The deposed general, now the acknowledged head of the small Ba'ath party, feverishly worked to organize party cells, and Hussein increasingly took charge of the party's security apparatus, as well as its dealings with peasants and its contacts with the military. Inveterate conspirator, he participated in another plot to kill the existing military ruler, and was imprisoned again for almost 2 years. In jail, he rose early, read incessantly, debated other prisoners, and, most important, maintained contact with Bakr, who harnessed Hussein's pragmatism, opportunism, ruthlessness, and ambition to his own schemes to seize power. With the incumbent regime reeling after the humiliating Arab defeat in the 1967 war with Israel, Bakr conspired with yet another small group of disaffected military officers. Hussein supported a tactical alliance. We should collaborate with them, but see they are liquidated immediately during or after the revolution, and I volunteer to carry out the task. And this is what happened. In July 1968, a small group of military officers, with the support of Ba'ath leaders, seized power in a bloodless coup. Bakr was designated president of Iraq, but real power rested with the Revolutionary Command Council. Immediately, Hussein went to work, orchestrating a plot to deport or kill 2 key generals who might challenge Bakr's leadership. Daring and shrewd, he succeeded, forcing them into exile. Bakr now quickly consolidated power and made Saddam his key assistant, the number 2 person in the party apparatus. Their aim was to make the nation loyal to the party and to make the Ba'ath malleable to their own designs. Both men were bent on gaining absolute power. Neither, could achieve this goal on his own. Hussein had no formal position in the cabinet. He occupied a small office adjoining Bakr's and was conspicuously deferential to Iraq's new president.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?